Because it is the top of the hour and we have a very exciting guest and host to share in our conversation over this lunch hour. So welcome everybody to the Rainforest in Alberta. We are going to get right into the nitty gritty. Before we start, I'm just going to hand it over to Craig Elias. As some of you know, Craig has previously brought authors to our city and will continue to do so in the coming year. So I'll let Greg tell you a little bit about that before we dig into the Rainforest book.
Perfect, Bridget. Thank you very much, everybody. Some of you earlier this year might have had a chance to be in a special session that we held with Ian Hathaway, who is Brett Feld, the founder of Techstars, co-author on this book. And we ended up with over 300 people that signed up for this event, and we gave away 100 copies of this book. And there's been lots of conversations that have been had since then. So one of the things we're going to start actually on April 9th is we're going to do the same thing every month for the next year. We might skip August, but the idea is to find a way to how do we build an army of skilled mentors, entrepreneurs, and service providers in the province. I'm going to put in the chat a link where people can go register. It is totally free. The idea is we'll have one author, and Corey Bray is our first author. Corey Bray is a sales mentor for The Alchemist down in San Francisco. The Alchemist is one of the most successful B2B accelerators on the planet. And one of the things that I have come to believe for a bunch of different reasons is that startups and scale-ups need something called a sales playbook. But I'm amazed how almost none of them have one. So what Corey's going to come share and what we're going to give away 100 copies of his book away after on is all about how do these startups and scale-ups build their first playbook. And this is the first of what will be 10 or 11 of these, depending on funding and schedule. So if you have any suggestions for future topics or future authors, do me a favor, just reach out, LinkedIn, text, email, whatever works. This is kind of the first one to help people get in the spirit and culture of how do we find a way to all help each other. And then we're going to start bringing in topics later on. Anything else you want to make sure I mention, Bridget?
That is perfect. Thank you, Craig.
Other than the fact that it's in partnership with Rainforest, Futurepreneur, VMSA, and is being partly funded by the Calgary Innovation Coalition, who's supporting this. So thank you to everybody for being part of this.
Thank you, Craig. Yeah, as Craig mentioned, we thought this would be a great opportunity to kind of reroute in our Rainforest work as we kick off that series and as the ecosystem continues to grow exponentially in our city. So let's get right into the meat and potatoes here this hour. I'm going to quickly introduce our host and our guest, and then I'll hand it over to them for this great conversation. So hosting our fireside chat today is our very own Rainforest co-founder. Most of you in the room don't need an intro, but for those newer to Calgary's innovation scene, please meet Jim Gibson, who has dressed up for us all today. He's a serial entrepreneur and an active leader in our local ecosystem. Jim is also the author of the 2018 book, Tip of the Spear, Our Species and Technology at a Crossroads. Jim is currently the Dean and Chief Catalyst at the School for Advanced Digital Technology at SAIT and the founding partner of the venture studio Thin Air Labs. Jim has played many roles in the ecosystem, from program lead for the Calgary Innovation Coalition, a mentor with VMSA and the A100, of which I see some of you others are on the call today, and an advisor to many local startups. So thank you so much for hosting today, Jim.
Our pleasure.
Thank you. Our guest of the hour is Mr. Greg Horowitt, co-author of the Rainforest book. And so Greg, for those of you who aren't familiar with Greg's other work, he's a serial entrepreneur, an investor, and also an innovation systems architect. Greg is a managing director of Jund Capital, as well as a member of the Society of Kaufman Fellows. He is the director of innovation design at the University of California and also serves as an adjunct lecturer on venture capital and innovation ecosystem design at Stanford University. With over 25 years of working in startups and venture capital, Greg is one of the pioneers in the field of innovation ecosystems. He is a trusted advisor to such notable organizations as the U.S. State Department, Aspen Institute, University of California, World Bank, and Inter-American Development Bank, in addition to his role as Senior Fellow with the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils. Greg continues his work today as an investor, advisor, and board member of multiple entrepreneurial startups. So it is an absolute pleasure to have you join us in Alberta, Greg. I'm just going to pass it over to the two of you to get the conversation started.
Thank you.
Greg, welcome. And it's a delight to see you again. Greg and I had probably one of my most fascinating and memorable chats about 2 years ago after he intersected us with us in ventures up here in Calgary. We had a great chat, and it was a real honor to meet you. And so I'm looking forward to this. We have some questions and some direction, but knowing you, Greg, we'll take it in the direction that we find ourselves. And so I'll just get this party started. What I wanted to do just quickly is just set a bit of genesis story for those of you who haven't met the Rainforest story. I just want to shout out to a couple of people and just some of the history of why we find ourselves at this point in time, and why Greg is the spirit animal to some extent of this movement here in Alberta, whether he knew it or not. And now he does, but he really, his book and so forth inspired us. And then I want to take a little bit of time to explore this concept of complex adaptive systems and how it applies to things like cities and innovation ecosystems, and bring Greg's experience in looking outside in other communities so that we can learn some things here in Calgary. And then I want to finish it off by really talking about some of the initiatives that we're doing here in the city and just get some reflection on that. I want to leave at least 20 minutes for questions, and I really encourage you to fire some off in the chat or put up your hand or do whatever. So with that, let me just do some rewind of the tape and give you some reminder of where we came from. And I'm looking at the screen here, and I know Brad, are you there? Can you put up your hand? Where are you? Brad's on wall. As many of you know, and I will repeat this, is the story of the Rainforest really started with Brad and the conversation that he had with folks that he was very close to. Brad's a great reader of innovation ecosystems. He's a student of how cities and how he can contribute to accelerating the world in which we find ourselves. And so he's a real student of what's going on. And Brad intercepted me 5 years ago in 2016, right around this time. And for some reason, which I can't recall, but we bumped into each other, and he said, "Gibson, good to see you." I didn't dispense with a lot of chat. He just said, "You got to read this book, and you got to read it right now." And I was heading out on vacation. Long story short, I picked up the book and I read it cover to cover. Rainforest, The Making of Silicon Valley. And it stopped me dead in my tracks, because at the time that we were finding ourselves in 2016, we recognized that while there was lots of activity, there was not a culture of trust and transparency and sharing amongst all the players in the ecosystem. And so when this book hit our desk, we recognized that there was something very special that took a deep understanding of what does complex systems mean. And how does that apply to something that was in transition, like the city of Calgary and the innovation ecosystem? And so with that, Brad, and the urban legend is, Brad said, "I'm heading away to my apple orchard for the summer," or Fernie, or wherever Brad goes in the summer. He says, "I want you to fill the room with the best and the brightest and the folks that we can put together in Banff. And I want you to go find the folks that wrote the book or were emphasizing it. And let's bring them to Banff." And so during the summer of 2016, I worked with Cynthia Van Sundert and Dave Edmonds of the A100, and we assembled a group of 65 people that we felt reflected the innovation ecosystem at that time. And it was a full range from academia, from municipal and political politicians to entrepreneurs, to the full spectrum. And when Greg and Victor Wang had wrote the book, they had worked with a group headed up by Henry Doss and Joe Sterling called the Rainforest Strategies Group, which decided to take the essence of the Rainforest Strategy book and put it into a series of interventions and conversations and facilitations. So we met with them and said, can you help us? And they did. And so Henry and Joe combined with Brad and I and 65 intrepid folks who had no idea what the agenda was going to be in Banff in September 2016, we kicked off with the Rainforest facilitation session, and the rest is kind of history. I'll shout out to Evan Hugh and Stephen Pills and Greg Hart and a number of other people. Sarah Lewis was there. After that first Rainforest session, we created what became the social contract. And so with that 10-step process, we had everybody physically sign the document, and the rest was history. We started Lunch Without a Lunch and proceeded to spend the next 300 Wednesdays in a row sharing the innovation ecosystem, and then subsequent summits and so forth. So Brad, I shout out to you as always, as the starter and funder and supporter and champion and cheerleader of this event. And then along the way, we got to meet Greg. I got to meet Greg and had this amazing opportunity to have a conversation with Greg. And I learned that this book came from a deep, deep understanding of what it was that we were doing as a species in innovation. And I was delighted. So that was a bit of a history, Greg. I think you know some of it, but I want to turn it over to you. And I'll start the conversation by really having you reflect, because I know the journey is amazing. Just talk a little bit about your journey and how you got to taking a look at complex systems and applying that to the reality and the situation we find ourselves in innovation ecosystem. How did that start, and where did that come from?
Completely accidental. We have this term that we use a lot. We call them happy accidents. Because I graduated with very much, so I'm a polymath. So I graduated with 3 degrees, one in biochemistry, one in economics, and one in music. Because my desire was going to be that I was going to be a musician. That's what I loved. I loved playing jazz. My parents wanted me to be a doctor. And I figured business would be good to study regardless of what I did, because anything I touched would eventually have some business component. So started off on a traditional, very enterprise career, working for a set of operating entities, and then eventually under operating companies under the Berkshire Hathaway umbrella. Eventually got bored though, because those businesses were very much predict and repeat. They were skills mastery of pattern development. You see things that need to get fixed and you kind of fix them. But after a while, it becomes a little bit boring because the challenge decreases. So a conversation with a mentor of mine led me to a startup in the Silicon Valley where he said, I think you'd be good to run this company. I left and took that big risk to run a company and made every mistake in the book. There's a saying that it's always better to be lucky than smart, but you need to know the difference. And I know the difference, that some of it was just timing and luck that we had, and we exited the company well. I then went to work as an entrepreneur in residence for one of the venture firms that had backed our company. And they gave me a desk and a hunting license and a checkbook. And the next company we invested in, we were fortunate enough to take public, and that then gave me, one of my mentors said that power is often all about having options. So I had some options, came back, took some time off, came back to San Diego where I'd gone to school, where my family was, and began mentoring startups as part of a local incubator. And 22 years ago, incubators were not a thing, or they certainly weren't as widespread as they are now. And Michael Porter had written a very interesting study, Harvard professor, on this thing he called clusters of innovation, these communities that were succeeding at doing innovation. And he did these small little case studies, and San Diego was one of those case studies. And what intrigued not only Porter, but also others who were reading this report, is that whereas Silicon Valley and Boston were these organic models that had grown up over time, had their roots in this kind of the defense industries and defense research, San Diego was one that was created out of crisis, that it had lost quite a few jobs that were dependent on defense after the end of the Cold War, and they had to figure out how to reskill and retrain these people. And so this incubator was set up, but it was an incubator without walls. People didn't physically take up residence in them, but it was a way to connect the community in a way. And I began mentoring onto startups as a part of that. Eventually, I took over as the director of that program as an interim director. And during that time, wrote a white paper on the future of these platforms about how do we better support entrepreneurs? How do we do a lot of translational and transformational tech? And I was talking about this kind of more complex adaptive system model and this globally connected model, that the resources we were going to need to help our startups were not necessarily going to reside next door to them or down the street, that these large social networks were going to be a driver for a lot of the insight and opportunities. And you had to think differently about how we did this. The other thing that I wrote about was that I thought that a lot of professors and academics who were writing about innovation were missing a key component. Even in the term clusters of innovation, it was about the aggregation of assets in close proximity, people with money, people with ideas, and people with other kinds of resources. And then magic just happened. And so what I asked them, then if you've dissected innovation in all these different ways, why do you think that people are having such a hard time following it or making it happen? And I was getting very insufficient answers. So it was not until I talked with some colleagues at Stanford University that I had these insights. And two professors at Stanford, Jeff Pfeffer and Bill Sutton, had written this book called The Knowing Doing Gap. And they said, often knowing what to do and having all that knowledge is highly disconnected from actually being able to do it. And this knowing doing gap is very responsible for it, because human beings are these interesting circuits. We think and perceive and have all these wonderful ideas, but somehow we then have to connect it through our heart and our gut. And then we use faith-based, movement to then go out and change the world. And somehow that circuit is somehow broken. And that was one of the big epiphanies, that all innovation was human-centric, that everything we create and design is often for other people. And it was a conversation I had with the head of the Center for Design Research, where I said, tell me about this thing you're working on called design thinking, because at that time it hadn't really propagated. And he says, it's quite simple. Design thinking is just all about teaching empathy. I said, well, who do you want to choose, or who do you want to teach empathy to? And he said, we want to teach it to bad people. I said, okay, who are bad people? Who are you identifying? And he pointed to me and he said, well, you're a bad person. And I said, why am I a bad person? He says, because as an entrepreneur, you go out and you change things, but without permission. And he said, very often you take your view of the world and you smother the rest of the world with your view of the world. He says, imagine how much better the world would be if you could inhabit the eyes and the souls of the people you touch, look through their eyes and reflect their values and build things that help them unleash their potential as well as yours. And then that was kind of the core of what we were looking at the rainforest. And so I began writing on this concept of innovation ecosystems as opposed to innovation clusters, that there was a human ecology and how people interacted with their environment was a key part. And whereas most of human evolution was about our conquering nature and bending nature to our will, which in the book we call plantations, these kind of nice linear models that serve us quite well when we know everything. But then there was another model we saw where we inhabit a larger ecosystem that is filled with lots of uncertainty and ambiguity and complexity, volatility, and learning how to navigate that as a hunter is a lot different than learning how to navigate a plantation as a farmer. And so it was about these two competing systems that we came on. And people then raised their hands and said, well, we want to learn more about these new kinds of systems. Can you help us with it? And so that was the genesis of our work.
And the book came out in, I believe it was 2014 or
2012.
2012.
But it was based on our research, primarily my research and the research of my team at UC San Diego and my colleagues.
Right.
So I walked in the footsteps of other people.
And I love your comment, Greg, about design thinking. We feel, and systems-based thinking, we feel like that's been around for a while. But 10 years ago, that required a leap of faith, either by individual organizations or ecosystems as they approach it. So, one of the things that we pulled out of the book was this need to be a systems-based thinker, because complex adaptive systems are really innovation ecosystems. Can I just reflect on one of the words, and I want to connect it to the work that we've been doing here in Calgary and Alberta, is this idea of empathy. And one of the things that one of the lasting legacies of your book in the city of Calgary and Edmonton and Alberta is our social contract. And it was a powerful extraction of something that was quite tangible for a lot of people. We've had thousands of people sign that social contract. We have networks now across Canada that are using this concept. But I'd love you to comment on this notion of trust and empathy, because I think in our conversation last, Greg, you said trust is important, but empathy is more. And I'd love you to just continue on that, because that's a big part of who we are.
Well, what we were observing is that trust was the primary currency. Paul Graham wrote a wonderful essay years ago, I think it was in the 80s, late 80s, called Cities and Ambitions. And he said, if you sit in coffee shops in any city and you eavesdrop on the conversations in a coffee shop around you, you'll eventually get to what people value and prioritize within that community. And he says, when I was in the Boston area, it was clear that intellect was the power currency. And then he said, when he moved to New York, it was very clear that money was the power currency, what you could buy. And he said, when he was in Washington, D.C., it was influence was the power currency. But then he came to the Silicon Valley and he says that was all tipped on its end, that really impact was the power currency. And in order for impact to become a power currency, you start with this trust-based currency. People have to have trust and faith that these audacious speculators, these people with big ideas, can actually accomplish it. Because as early stage venture investors, we're really looking at two things: the potential of an idea and the potential of a group of people to act on that idea. And so we rely very heavily on our intuition and heuristics to do a lot of the assessments, because there isn't this long historical track record of data that we can look at. And that's where trust really comes in, either our trust in the people directly or these proxies of trust, these people that they know that vouch for them, that we also know and we vouch for as well, what we call this transference of trust. And we use that as the currency that drives a lot of these transactions.
I love that idea of the trust as the currency, and I think that we've worked really, really hard to continue to bring that as a part of our social contract, among other things. But trust is the driving force. What I'd like to do is just shift it a little bit and talk about, Greg, I think you haven't lived here. You don't necessarily know the zeitgeist of Alberta and Calgary and the challenges that we're going through, but I think you get a sense of it, having had conversations and observed it. We're a city in fundamental transition. We're a city that's looking at its regional bioeconomic diversity is about to shift on us, and we either can drive it and lead it, or it can be imposed upon us. As you reflect on cities or places that you've observed around the world, cities in transition, what are some of the things that you've observed, successful or non-successful, across other jurisdictions that you've had the fortune to actually work with, or even companies that have had to do that as well? What are some of the characteristics that they find themselves in?
Yeah, so one is that all systems are bipolar. You have a group of people at the top who delegate down everything from resources and culture and literacy, and then there's this bottom-up effort, which is where all this passion, speculative design, and speculative efforts come from. And you have to have a system that's quite flexible, that allows the people at the bottom to become the top, and the top to, like a snow globe that you're turning over and over. So that's really important. The other thing is that these movements have to be led and passioned by these entrepreneurial mindsets and these entrepreneurs. So if you put people, in fact, we've seen that in other places that love the idea and want a very prescriptive recipe, and the first thing they do is they put someone who's more bureaucratic or someone who is more of a traditional program manager in charge. And those usually underwhelm the system.
And I think, one of the things, Greg, that and Bridget knows this, and Brad and some of the folks who've been around, we always struggled a little bit in the Rainforest that everyone would come to us and go, who's in charge? And we like to say, well, nobody but everybody. And this idea that it's not amorphous, but it doesn't lend itself well to bureaucratic systems.
It's distributed. In the book, we talk about this difference between ecosystems and ecosystems. Once you have a lot of defined pathways, you can build these pyramids, these command and control pyramids, where you anoint someone at the top with, ultimate power and authority, and then they delegate downwards. But in highly emergent systems, you look more like the US Navy SEALs or special forces than you do like a traditional infantry, where it's more about the timing rather than your title. And then you redefine even the term leadership, because leadership is no longer about traditional management. It's about knowing when to step in, when to delegate, and how everyone plays a role rather than a title.
Yeah. Well, and just, I see a lot of people on this call that I know well, and I'm going to come at you if you don't put out questions. So just me, right? I'm going to just point out a name, and I'm going to put you on the spot. So be ready. Anyways, one more thing. I love ecosystems versus ecosystems. I forgot that phrase. That's awesome. I just want to let you know, and if anybody's on the call here from CRIN, I just want to give a quick shout out to the implications of what's happened with your book and on the ecosystem of Canada, not just Calgary and Alberta, is on our second immersion event. So we had our September immersion event in 2016, and then we had a subsequent one 6 months later in Banff in March. We invited half of the group was academics and the leadership from large institutions, and the other half was the energy industry. And because we felt in the technology space, we were not having that open, trust-based conversation with the energy systems. And one of the people who attended that first session was Joy Romero. And Joy was the vice president at the time of research and innovation for one of our largest producers in Canada, CNRL. And Joy came up to me halfway through the session, about 2 feet off the ground, and said, "I found my tribe." And here was traditional oil and gas, a leader of innovation coming and said, "I found my tribe." And fast forward 3 years later, they have founded an organization called the Clean Resources Innovation Network with funding from $100 million from the federal government. And they've built their entire organization based on the principles of the rainforest and the social contract. There's over 3,500 companies and individuals across Canada, from Victoria to Newfoundland, that have used the social contract as a way to guide people from the very, very edge of the innovation in the clean tech space, working alongside the folks from Synovus and CNRL and so forth. So I just want to give a shout out, Greg, you unintended consequences, but I would argue that there's a potential here to transform how we think of energy in Canada based on the principles of the rainforest. So
the reason I like that is because so much of the intentional design of innovation ecosystems is the engineered serendipity. You really want to create space for those random collisions as opposed to the formal ones, which is why even now in this time of COVID, we have all these kind of formalized discussions, and it's taken away part of those just random serendipitous thing, which is why some of these tools like Clubhouse that are coming now are so nice, because they introduce that kind of engineered serendipity.
Love that term. That was one of the other terms I pulled out of the book. We use that a lot in the early days, right? It's this idea that while serendipity is uncertain, but you can engineer it. You can create the conditions that make sense of that.
You can create the conditions, which is important, because the first rule of innovation is you can't make it happen. All you can do is increase the chances that it happens. And so the reason that most governments and institutional systems have trouble with this is because in order to grow, you have to let go. Because most of the time it's like a tube of toothpaste. We think that by exerting more pressure, we can get more out of it. And this is exactly the opposite, that if we create a set or optimize a set of conditions within a community, we naturally increase the chances that it can happen, but it's not about manipulating the system directly.
Lovely. So with great, I'm gonna take a bit of a shift and a break. You and I could sit and talk with you. With a beer would be even better, but we'll deal with that. We'll deal with that later.
I'm going to hold you to that.
Yeah, Bridget, let's work on that. So hey, you guys in the ecosystem, I'm coming for you. So be ready.
Mark asked a question too in the chat.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to Mark here in a second on his question, but I'm going to look at my good friend, Mr. Kierstead, because I see him. He's right in front of my screen. I love him.
And he's smiling.
And James, just so you know, Greg, I don't know if you've met James or heard, James was our co-conspirator up in Edmonton as he took a look at the ecosystem there and said, hey, this is something we need to champion. And James has been a compatriot and as I say, co-conspirator in building the rainforest. And James, I just, I know you and I've shared a lot of thoughts on this. And, do you have anything that you wanted to comment with Greg or chat?
Yeah, so we have a little bit of a different group up here in Edmonton. It's all volunteers. We don't have, we're unfortunate we don't have someone like Bridget to kind of drive the mechanism. So my question, Greg, is, how do you really maintain momentum when you're in this with a leadershipless organization or movement like the Rainforest?
So empower. The shortest answer is by empowering others. But what we find is that the new book I'm working on is now called The Religion of Innovation, because we see this akin to these kind of belief movements. And I'm looking at religion more in a secular sense, that you have these messages, what historically has been called this Messiah or this messenger, but then you've got this layer of apostles and disciples and evangelists. And the question is, how do you kind of create those layers? How you take these messages and then hand them to other people, but then allow them to craft those messages so that they go out and the intentionality of the core message stays the same, but these messages are put to different groups in ways that they can relate to, in ways that they can grab onto, that they can take ownership of. And then that's where the epiphany and the empowerment really comes. Even in some of the tools we created, which we open sourced in the book, the Rainforest Canvas,
Right.
The reason we created that is because it was a way to host a common conversation. There is absolutely nothing magical about that canvas, which is why we open sourced it, but as a way to begin having common conversations and aligned definitions. So, and the way we've always taught the canvas is that we bring people into a room and we discuss them, how it works, and then we train them. But for those people who have gone to medical school or been in the science of learning inside of a medical institution is you watch one, you do one, and then you teach one. So we use the same methodology and movements. We let people come in and they can talk to people like us or you. Then what you do is you have them do something around it, and then they become the teachers. You then flip the paradigm, and as teachers, they then go out and teach more people and then begin flipping that paradigm. And it's the dynamic of back and forth that eventually everyone becomes this ecosystem expert as opposed to one person.
Excellent. Thanks, James. A great comment, great question. And I'll flip it into the chat with Mark. And Mark, we met, and I love where you're coming from on this. Mark talks about this idea. Are we really leaning into collaboration? Have we really understood how we can move faster in the spirit of Alberta's doing its best and Calgary's doing its best, but we're behind and we need to move more quickly? Is there something that we could think about in terms of how we manage the competitive forces that are natural in an ecosystem and move faster? Are there examples that you've seen, Greg, around the world where we can move faster because we learn to be better at collaboration? It's a tough question.
Well, the largest part of any transaction, including human transaction, people together, is just the trust. And so once you kind of build the trust, there's a kind of a natural inclination to accelerate a lot of these things. And kind of a tale of two cities part was, people often ask me, especially after I wrote the book, is what is the real big difference between even the town you're in, San Diego, and the Silicon Valley at the time? And I said, the big difference is when I have an audacious idea and I bring it to my colleagues in San Diego, the first hour of the conversation is, let me tell you every reason why this isn't going to work, why it's going to fail.
Right.
In the Valley, people are saying, well, if this could work, what are the 2 or 3 things we need to know to figure it out? And you work from the faith base that it's possible to work. And then you back into how do we validate or invalidate that thesis, which is really how complex adaptive systems work as opposed to complicated systems. One is about, predict and repeat and kind of the known. It's all about probability and predictability, but complex adaptive systems are all about possibility and plausibility. And so
Right.
first is you have to change the mindset. That's one. 2, small little experiments where the risk can be distributed among those experiments. So don't try to take these big leaps and never try to boil the ocean. So it's lots of small things. And that's the hardest thing for many regions to embrace, that the innovation or rainforest movements are never about one thing. It's about lots of small things that over time begin converging, just as like you're beginning to see all these little efforts that may look different, but somehow begin aligning to the same intention, which is why the alignment of intention, the social contract, is far more important than the alignment of agreement, which is the congruence of opinion.
Yeah.
And that's why you start with that.
Yeah, excellent point. It's that alignment factor is something that we know and feel really well. I know my colleague Margot Purcell is smiling at those last comments, Greg, I can assure you. And Susanna here in the chat talks about random acts of collaboration, the conspicuous collaboration that just says, hey, let's just do it and work together. What I want to do, I got a couple of really good questions, deep questions in the chat. I just want to reach out to one of my colleagues who's been there since the very beginning. And one of the institutions here, Greg, in Alberta, in Calgary, one of the publicly funded agencies of both the city and the universities was an organization called Innovate Calgary, which morphed in the last couple of years to become an organization called Platform. And Platform is really becoming the backbone, if you will, of the innovation conversation and challenges. And Terry Rock, I think Terry's here. Terry's witnessed this kind of journey, both from looking into the public system and saying, how do we make that happen, work, and then working with entrepreneurs. And Terry, I know you've been observing the rainforest and really one of its biggest champions. Is there anything you wanted to ask Greg while he's here, or any comments you wanted to make?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with, one of the things that I think is really interesting is going from describing a rainforest working and changing a system that isn't that to that over time. And like, how do you change a big system? So I don't know if you know Ed Morris and Greg, but we've now in Calgary started working with the strategic doing group out of Northern Alabama University, used to be out of Purdue. And I got a note already in the chat, but there's a bunch of people who've been taking this. This is about complex adaptive collaboration using agile methods. And there's 50 people actually in Alberta, which I think speaks to the desire to work in this way, to figure out how to just do small experiments, but at scale to change a whole system. And so one of the privileges I have is that as a result of Rainforest coming to Calgary, the real thing I wanted to ask you about, actually, so I just wanted to point that out to everybody, but there is that the founding group decided that place matters. And I think one of the key messages was the engineered serendipity. And so Platform Calgary became the vehicle to create the place. We're building an innovation center in downtown Calgary, opening this year. And we named ourselves Platform on purpose because we are government funded, and the worst thing that we could do is try to tell everybody what to do. What we're really working on trying to do is to create a platform for this whole ecosystem to take off and to actually start delivering results. That's why we're doing things like learning strategic doing. That's why we've now got 50 partnership MOUs signed, and are starting to work with those groups to say, okay, how can we be something you can build on? So here's, I have two questions. One is, what advice would you give someone that's trying to do that? And second, how do you convince people to put dollars into the place matters side of it, the engineered serendipity side of it, when they've never experienced it before? They just don't get, a lot of people don't get this because it seems like magic, right?
So
like the value prop of it, I get it. I think everybody in this call gets it, but we got to convince more people to actually get resources behind this stuff.
excellent question. 99% of what makes innovation happen is completely invisible. And you can experience it, but you can't touch it. And so most people want these things they can touch, take apart, and you really can't do that. So one of the very first things we do with all regions we work with is we start by taking a leadership group or a community group, and we bring them to an ecosystem like Silicon Valley. And rather than trying to over manipulate them, the first thing we do is we take them and we introduce them to their counterparts in the ecosystem there. And that's the first day. The second day, we bring everyone in to talk about how all the pieces fit together, the connection points. Why do people pay things forward? Why do people take risks when it's not in their mandate? Or it may even decrease their what we call behavioral fitness. It may actually decrease their status or potential temporarily for something that may happen tomorrow. And by them experiencing it, it's really, really important to curate that experience, because the mistake that too many people make when they get on planes and they go to study, let's say Silicon Valley, is they go to the incubators, they go to the accelerators, and they say, oh, we've got to recreate this workspace, or we've got to create this fund. And that's really only about 10% of what makes that thing work. The human connections and how people collaborate and how you engineer the serendipity, that has to be experienced. So that's how one of the ways you do it.
Right.
People ask us about our programs, and I'm like, okay, like that's part of it, but that's only going to move us a little ways. It's not about it's like the whole system moving at a different pace to produce 10 times the results is the collective work that we all have to do.
That's right.
Of course. And I loved how Margot said this is meaningful versus mechanical.
That's right.
I like it.
Terry, great, really good, and it teases out some of the underlying philosophies that you have to think about every day, and so that's why I wanted you to give you a chance to talk. Now I'm going to take a little license here.
I will say though, for Terry, so much of this is about biomimicking. People, it's no accident that people get on planes and overcome social and geographic distance to join a network, to join a cluster, to join a ecosystem. And all ecosystems are not the same. And so when people join, there's a set of criteria that they join for, things that drive them there. And so much of it is biomimicking. They want to be like, or they want to emulate somebody. And so you have to put them in close proximity to those. And that's really how that emotional change happens, when someone says, I can do that, or I aspire to be like that.
Yeah, I just listened to a podcast from the founder of Airbnb, who is a Rhode Island School of Design grad. And he said he'd never in his life met an entrepreneur until he effectively became one. And so as a design student, he was never inspired by an entrepreneur, so he couldn't even start to mimic it. And so a big part of his mission is to help people get these kind of experiences, which I think is a common shared one amongst all of this too. And clearly in your book is one of the key things that we have to create. We have to together foster those opportunities for the next generation to come up.
Yeah, excellent, Terry. Greg, I'm gonna shift gears a bit on because I'm absorbing some of the great commentary in the chat, which guys, I totally expected from this amazing group of people. I'm gonna hit on something that's near and dear to my heart. I recently became the dean and chief catalyst of a brand new school here in Calgary called the School for Advanced Digital Technology, and I can't tell you the number of conversations we have around this city right now that says the machine's moving, the capital's starting to come here. The single biggest gap that we have right now is talent. And so, you know, there's a number of conversations here on bringing this mindset and this ecosystem and complex adaptive systems thinking and just systems thinking to the world of education, the world of talent design, and so forth. So this is an area that we're trying to bring to shake up and shape because frankly, Greg, the speed at which we have to move now as a city is actually not in the normal economic time horizons. It's very quick. And we really have to make some moves or we're going to be left behind even more. And talent is the thing. Is there any comments you'd want to make based on your experience on how we can shift the conversation around talent, make it more accessible, increase the pace and speed and the types of things that talent needs to recognize in this new way?
I mean, that's a tough one because the first minimal requirement of any innovation ecosystem is curiosity. Someone has to be at least interested in exploring something. And the reason the Valley works so well and systems like that is because it's overfilled with people with intellectual hedonism. You know, people who are just curious about something and then kind of act on it. So the talent question, one thing I do is I give people some books to read on that subject. Jim Clifton wrote a wonderful book years ago called The Coming Job Wars, about how the next big battleground isn't for technology, it's for talent. And then all the empirical evidence behind that. So we kind of introduce that as companies become digital and as they become less geographically dependent, then what we realize is that the supply demand shifts slightly in that what Richard Florida says is that smart people, jobs are going to where the smart people are. The smart people don't have to go where the jobs are because these jobs can be created in these different kinds of environments. So then the question for any economic developer is how do we attract the best and the brightest talent? And one, you create opportunity, but also you talked about this amenities of place. There are all these little conditions you have to create to attract them because you have to compete for their attention, their imagination, and for their action.
Excellent. I mean, and part of what we've collapsed that into in the world that we're working in right now, because we have some control over it, is this idea of awareness, mindset, and then skills. Is the idea that we need to understand. I love expressing that in the terms of curiosity. Right? In the absence of curiosity, you won't create the energy that people will even make the first step to be aware or then shift their mindset. So
yeah, when we in the new book, because it focuses around a lot, how do you create these belief systems? Where do you start? How do you kind of create them? How do you turn them into a movement? And how do you move them? And there's a quote I put in the book which says, for those who believe no evidence is necessary, for those who do not, no evidence will suffice. And so sometimes trying to convince someone, give someone a new belief or give someone a new framework when they already have one that they're very comfortable with is a bit of a fool's errand. It consumes a tremendous amount of energy, as opposed to talking to those people who have open minds and are potentially looking for something new. So then your question is, how do you find those people? Excellent.
A couple of other questions coming out of the out of the chat, which are fantastic. Ruth Ann talks about psychological safety. One of her questions says, employers embracing psychological safety will be the talent takers of the 21st century. Do you have any comments on that concept? Is that a concept that you're aware of?
Yes, and the way we're dissecting it, so one of the nice things I have with my role at the University of California, San Diego, is I've got a large sandbox to experiment with some of these new constructs. And one of them is creating this Keystone Academy, which is, what does the next generation of leaders and leadership look like? How do we move the concept of leadership away from just purely this management construct and more of saying that everyone has the potential to be leaders? But one of the key things that we find, we say that excellent entrepreneurs know how to climb hills, but extraordinary entrepreneurs know how to cross valleys. And in the book, we do this kind of contrast between Netflix and Blockbuster and the whole kind of background on that. But what we find is that in order to navigate the future, particularly an unknown future, people have to be able to lean into uncertainty, ambiguity, complexity. And you need to give them new kinds of tools, because very often we conflate our comfort zones with our safety zones. We kind of push them together. What we try to do is to show people how we can take them out of that comfort zone, which is where all the cool stuff happens, and still help them understand they're safe. And what we find is with some of these extraordinary entrepreneurs, they know how to very correctly manage what are called amygdala hijacks, the flight or fight response, the reptilian brain, this thing that says, whoa, danger, I should walk away. My colleagues disapprove of me, society disapproves of me.
Right.
I'm at risk of losing not only status, but potentially money and other things. And how you help people navigate, how you help them understand when there is true threat versus when there's only a perceived threat. And so we're actually creating training programs in partnership with our neuroscience and cognitive science departments, our psychology group, and creating new training programs of how to teach the next generation of entrepreneurial warriors in this.
Excellent. Entrepreneurial warriors. Excellent. So Greg, do me a favor, just while I go pick on somebody else in the audience and be ready. Just drop the name of your book into the chat, just so everybody can have a look at it. I know I'll be jumping on it.
The book we're working on right now is not out yet, but I'll just put it in there. Yeah,
put it in there, because we'll be all over it. Brad, are you in the orchard? Are you available? Can I call on you to say a couple of words, or at least jump in and talk to Greg? Are you there?
Yes, on audio, Jim, if you got that.
I do. Thank you, Brad. Good to hear from you, man.
Yes, I've been enjoying the proceedings. It's just fantastic to hear directly from Greg, and so energizing. And some of the comments in the chat that I am following, Jim, and that we together, all of us, have had influence on, is for the first time ever in the whole province, the government now published the goals that A100 and myself have been pushing so long, for the government to kind of set the magnitude of the objectives that we should all carry over the next 10 years. And, we now have with those goals kind of the answer to, in order to what. We talk about the social contract, and we talk about the principles of the rainforest, and all these ways of looking at it, in order to what. And the answer, in order to what, is to keep everything rolling as best we can, but then, as the budget indicated, create 900 new tech companies of all sizes, from starting to scaling to growth stage, 20,000 net new jobs, and $5 billion in 2030 revenue. And so now we have an objective, kind of a solver type exercise, where we can plug in what kind of resources we need. We can plug in why we have to come together and have this new infrastructure, like platform in Calgary and other things in Edmonton, to get to those kind of goals. And it's just so grounding to have you, Jim, and Greg kind of remind us of these principles, and how elusive and important this type of work is to really build the kind of place and province, and keep those kind of intellectually curious folks happily employed here, challenged, and combining to build great products and serve great customers. And so there's just so much grounding here. Really appreciate the conversation, and thanks so much for taking the time, both Jim and Greg.
And Greg, this is the implication. This is for what end, right? As we started the Rainforest 5-6 years ago, we didn't have an end necessarily in mind. And one of the things that Brad has done with his contacts and influence is answered that fundamental question: for what end? that helps the economic agencies, helps the government, helps all sorts of people understand that there is a real goal that you can touch and feel and see, versus simply the starting of the flywheel that your book did for the ecosystem. So, you know, if you want a case study, this is how you get to get to why and get to what. So, Bridget, if you have any other questions, there's a couple of people I want to call on, but Bridget, I just want to make sure that you get to jump in and maybe filter some of the comments that have come in, or if there's anything that you see jumping out that you want me to talk about.
And Jim, by the way, I put a graphic into the chat function about this concept of VUCA and how we kind of manage the difference between situational awareness, just kind of knowing where we're at and what's going on around us, as well as what we call anticipatory awareness, what might happen as a result of what we're doing.
Yeah, right.
So it gives you some good frameworks on that.
Thank you. Thank you. Bridget, anything from you?
So much, Jim. There's so much swimming around in my mind right now. There was a question from Igor that I'm also just curious about, around the idea of how community can be translated into a company structure. It's something I've been researching lately, and I know in the US, community is a major focus of tech companies. And so if you could comment on that, Greg, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, so the concept of community is that connectedness, but it's embedded in the culture, which again goes to that concept of the social contracts, the values and intentions. How do we translate the intentions or our aligned intentions into a set of outcomes? And so they're very easily translated. What's particularly different with inside of companies, the primary metric that many companies use, of course, is a financial or fiscal bottom line. Do we increase shareholder value? Whereas within many communities, it's the social benefit and the welfare, the emotional and physical welfare of the people they serve. So that's what's slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Greg, we've got kind of 3 minutes, and I really do. You've graced us with your time and energy and spirit.
I love doing
whether you knew it 6 years ago, you did, and I really appreciate you spending the time. Can I just give you a bit of the last word to say, you know, we've worked really hard to get where we are. We've grounded it in some of the principles that you espoused. You know, as we look to Brad's vision of real results, is as you look around the world, you know, is the word of advice or encouragement that you want to give the Calgary and Alberta ecosystem some last words for us? No pressure.
It's not so much that, it's just that, you know, this very often the reductionist mindset, you know, does the opposite of serving us. But I really boil a lot of these efforts down to two key words: audacious speculation. This idea that very often the future, as we move and we lean into the future, we don't have all the answers. In fact, the answers get created through these small experiments this journey we're going to go on together. And our ability to do that is also our ability to absorb these small little risks, you know, whether it's social and status risk, which is why a lot of entrepreneurs who have been successful don't use status or that kind of personal gain as a calibration mechanism for how well they're doing. They don't wait until everyone agrees with them. And we see this a lot, even with investors we work with, that, you know, people said, oh, we want to be able to invest in the next Facebook or the next Google or support these kinds of companies. And I'm saying that sounds really nice, but if I presented the next Facebook to you tomorrow, you would probably dismiss it, because the truth about innovation journeys is that they will first ignore you, they will ridicule you, they will eventually attack you, and then eventually they take what you're doing as self-evident, you know. But it's only after a period of time when it's been accepted by others for it. But usually all innovation babies are born ugly. So the question is not to how to only create beautiful babies, but how to really recognize opportunity, and how to create, you know, that level of grit within your ecosystem, those people who are persistent. And also to using that curiosity framework is what we find about systems that disproportionately do innovation well is they don't wait until there's an environmental or evolutionary prompt to change. They change before there is any prompt. And that's highly unusual. most systems or people will only change once there's a reason to change. But in places like the Valley, people change because they're just curious. I wonder what it'd be like if we can change the way we do transportation, which is Uber. We change the way we do hospitality. The market wasn't asking for that, but they fulfilled a desire rather than just merely a need. And that's kind of how you need to think about this.
Fantastic way to end it, Greg. Those are the words that I think many on this call live by, and I think we'll take that going forward. So I really want to thank you on behalf of
Well, thank you.
an incredible journey that we've had here at the Rainforest, and I'm just honored and delighted to be a part of it. So thank you for sharing the time. Bridget, I know you've got a couple of announcements, and thank you.
Thanks for everyone showing up.
Yeah.
The first step, there's an old expression that 50% of life is just showing up. So I thank you for showing up and letting us share.
Yeah, and I love that about curious Calgarian, or curious people rather. I think that's Rainforest attracts a lot of curious Calgarians, so really speaks well to our audience. So thank you, Greg. Thank you, Jim. We're running over time here, but two really quick announcements from the Rainforest. We want everyone who hasn't had the opportunity to read the book, many have commented that they have. We have 100 copies to send out to the community, and our only ask is that you circulate them to someone else once you're finished. So Amber has put the link in there several times, but it keeps getting lost in the chat. Fill out a form there and we will mail out a free copy of the Rainforest book. Greg, we look forward to your next book being released. The second announcement is that a follow-up to this conversation will be hosted on May the 4th at the Rainforest Annual Summit. It will be an all-morning event, so save the date, May the 4th. Be with you. I have to say it, right? Okay, so again, many thanks to Greg and Jim, and we look forward to keeping this conversation going. It spurred a lot for myself, and I'm sure a lot of people in the room today.
Be well, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.